we finish. So the first thing we would like to do is encourage everybody to engage on social media. Please use hashtag PPIAI, Peace Movement. That will give you the ability to stay connected after we finish the presentation. It'll give you the ability to see the types of peace initiatives that everyone wants to start. Everyone will get a chance to share their experience, talk about the initiatives they want to do, and also watch the initiatives everyone else does. So it's just a good way to connect. We'll be doing this via LinkedIn and also Twitter. It will also give us the ability to track the impact of the presentation that we're making and see how things cascade from here. Whenever you make your post on LinkedIn or Twitter, please tag us, the Public Policy in Africa Initiative, Hugh, our founder, and then myself, Benjamin. There are some people who says there's no sound. Can anybody hear me?
Yes, I can't hear you.
Yes.
Can hear you.
Can hear you.
Okay.
We hear you, Benjamin.
Okay, and then I'll adjust the settings real quick to make sure everything is good. So the first thing we could start with is just defining peace studies. So it's an interdisciplinary field of inquiry animated by a desire to build sustainable peace at all levels of society through policy relevant research and practice on a broad range of pressing topics, including concepts and processes that demand justice, promote healing and create equitable societies, the root causes of violence in all its form, including physical, structural, cultural, and environmental, strategies to prevent, end, and transform violent conflict through nonviolent means, and approaches to promote structural and institutional change at local, national, and global levels. One important thing to note about peace is that it's an absence of conflict, but there's much more to it. So we want to move forward with Galtung's idea of positive and negative peace. So negative peace is kind of a more simpler definition we just mentioned, the absence of violence or fear of violence, but positive peace actually goes further than that. It's attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So there's two pieces to this. We want to not only make sure that there's an absence of violence or fear of violence, we want to also make sure that there are things to kind of keep this thing going and make that idea sustainable. So there's a principle I think that would be good for us to think about as we move forward throughout the presentation. So the idea is that the world does not have to be violent and it doesn't have to be unfair. However, we shouldn't be naive and think that there won't ever be any conflict or there won't ever be anything bad. So we should try to do our best to minimize these things that come up over time. And so I would like to encourage us to think about our community being global. There's multiple levels of community, of course. So we have, our nuclear family, for example, our extended families, our neighborhoods, our cities, our countries, and then we have the entire world. But the more that time goes by and we become connected through things like media, we become connected through trade between countries, for example, the more that the community becomes globalized. And I think it's a good idea to view things from that particular perspective. And so peace studies will be very heavily reliant on social science. There's a list of a few social science disciplines that we will use throughout understanding or moving through peace studies. So things like sociology, psychology, economics, political science, anthropology, and more. And so we want to think about who the actors are in the peacemaking process. We'll use Lederach's triangle or Lederach's pyramid in order to understand who these actors are and what place they have in the peacemaking process. And so in general, if we look at the pyramids from the bottom to the top, you'll see that people tend to have, peace tends to impact more the people at the bottom of the pyramid compared to the top. And the strategies that people will use to peacemake from the bottom to the top will become different. So at the bottom, we're much closer to the community or the population level. These are grassroots organizations, or it's grassroots, meaning we have local leaders or elders. We have NGO and community workers, women and youth groups, local health officials, and social workers. These are the people who make up the bottom or the bulk of what will be happening in the peacemaking process. In the middle, we have leaders respected in sectors, ethnic and religious leaders, academics and teachers, NGO leaders, professionals, and media journalists. These people in some ways have kind of connections to the top, and they will approach the peacemaking process from a particular position. And then at the top, of course, we have the military, police, and religious leaders with high visibility, people in business and government officials. And so at the very bottom, the types of things they will do, things like rallies, community events, helping your local neighbor will differ, for example, from what people at the top do, which are things like policies, military interventions, etc. And so one thing that's important to have is self-awareness and self-awareness, and think about the idea of morality. So we need to be aware of who we are, including our background. So sometimes if we have a particular background, it can be very hard to connect with people who are experiencing violence or experiencing the fear of violence, especially if we come from a very privileged position. We need to think about the value judgments that we're making throughout the peacemaking process. And we need to think about the value judgments we make ourselves and whether or not that contributes to a problem. And then also, if we're coming from a point of view of privilege, we want to make sure that we don't have a savior complex, thing like that. And so there are several theories of peace that we will utilize throughout the peacemaking process. Sorry, give me 1 second. There's a setting that I need to adjust on these presentation slides. Sorry, everybody. There's one thing I need to adjust really quick. Okay, perfect. So the theories we will use, we'll start off with realism. So these are the ideas: balance of power and use of force.
Yes.
And so we want to make sure that we balance power between things like countries or institutions, because balancing the power will make sure that we have a balance of conditions, for example, that will lead to things like violence. And then also the idea of use of force. So in some situations, you will have to use force or some kind of other, you could see as non-ideal intervention in order to implement peace or keep the peacemaking process going. Liberalism is just the idea that within the democratically, whether it's liberal or conservative, people will have to vote and all contribute towards having peace. Constructivism is just the idea that we all together contribute to the idea of the peacemaking process, whether it's individuals, whether it's community members, etc. And we kind of construct this idea. It's not necessarily something that's concrete or set in stone, but it's kind of like a social norm that we create. We have Marxism, which is really famous in the social sciences. We also have feminism, which is very important and contributing to a lot of progress that we're making across the world, but it also is probably one of the areas we need to focus on the most. And even that approach is super important when we think about something like the Sustainable Development Goals. We have peace psychology as well, which is just the idea of understanding how people think about or how people relate about peace within their own selves. And then we have critical theory. And so throughout the peacemaking process, we want to be empirical. So we want to make sure that we're data-driven. We're doing interventions that work. We want to make sure that we show things are going on the way we think they're going on so we can rally more people to our cause. We want to quantify things appropriately so we can understand the scale of what's happening and then address it accordingly. And then we want to make sure that if we place blame, it is done rightfully so. And so here's a diagram on the analysis for intervention and conflict. So we want to start, if we look at the middle, for example, we want to start with planning and intervention. And then we always want to make sure that we're implementing it correctly and within context. And we're constantly monitoring and evaluating those interventions to make sure that they work and things are going appropriately. Some of the things we need to think about, for example, are context, the causes and the actors, and those will make a huge difference in terms of not only implementing the intervention, but also the success of the intervention. And so there are a few different types of violence that we'll outline here. There's physical violence and psychological violence. So people can be harmed physically, or they can be harmed in terms of their inner selves, their inner peace, or in terms of their way of going about relationships. There's personal and there's structural violence. You could think of this as like the scale of targeting. So are you targeting, for example, specific individuals? Are you targeting things in specific, or are you creating structural conditions to continue violence over time? We have intended and unintended violence. So not all the time do people necessarily intend, or not all the time does something necessarily intend for violence to happen against certain people, but if it does, then we need to try to address that. And then if violence happens against people in a non-intended way, then we need to address that as well before it becomes a prolonged issue and that it does become something structural. And then there's also manifest and latent violence. So violence that's observable that everyone can obviously see, and then violence that's latent, that's happening beneath the scenes, that is much harder to see and address. And so here is a flow chart that kind of talks about how different types of violence manifest. So if we start off on the bottom, we can see that violence manifests structurally, for example, through inequality and repression. In the middle, we have cultural violence manifests culturally through religious and ethnic means. And then violence can manifest directly through physical, psychological means. And then within physical, we can have death and personal injury. We can have harm to health, and we can have imprisonment / physical restraint. And when thinking about this flow chart, violence can happen in so many different ways, and it can be hard to think about who the actors are, what their impact is in terms of a community or whoever is being harmed, and then also being able to address it. So it could be something as simple as, discarding trash in a community that is harming them, but you don't really do anything about it. It could be something as large as a genocide, for example, and there's a huge range of things that it can affect. And so we should think about this flow chart a lot within peace studies. And so when we think about what is usually causing violence and conflict, there's a few categories. I think someone has their microphone unmuted. Would you mind muting it so we can, okay, that way there's not too much interference. So if we think about what's causing violence from an economic point of view, there's colonialism and the impacts that colonialism has had from the past up until today. There's income inequalities that usually cause conflicts and violence. And then there's quest for mineral and natural resources. These are all economically related and contribute significantly to violence, not just within countries, but across borders. Then we have agriculture and energy, because we're very dependent on this. And as population keeps growing, especially in some regions, this will exacerbate this. And as we move forward, agriculture and energy will probably become much bigger issues because that's kind of impacted by climate change, which is later on in the presentation. But as we have more people, we have to grow more food, or at least fight over more food. We have to create more energy. We have to make sure that we not only have enough of those things, but we distribute them correctly, which also can contribute to violence and conflict. And then we have technology, which is a huge enabler for development, but it makes injustices and inequalities more visible. That can be a good or a bad thing. So there's a lot of things that happen related to violence and conflict across the world that we aren't necessarily able to see. For example, here in the United States, it'd be very hard to see what's going on in, let's say, Myanmar, but the ability to have technology and social media will make that more salient. In terms of climate change, millions of people are becoming displaced by climatic events. That includes people who are being forced to move somewhere else where they may or may not be welcomed. People could lose access to things like water sources. They could lose the ability to do agriculture and farm and create food. There's multiple different ways that climate change affects us. And as it gets worse and worse as time goes on, if we don't address it, that will be a large or bigger contributor to violence and conflict. And lastly, we have religion, governance, and politics. These issues are the most fundamental in the structure of a society, so they are definitely a big contributor to violence and conflict. Over time, they've probably been the largest contributor to violence and conflict if we look at the history of humanity, because climate change is relatively a new thing. Technology, while we've had it in the past, it's much different now with like media and the spread of information compared to the past. So these are the main causes of violence and conflict. And there's a couple of examples I want to show of conflict trees. So at the bottom, we'll have causes. We'll have the core problem as kind of the stem or the trunk of the tree.
Good morning.
Then
Good
we
evening.
will have effects. Hello?
All fine.
Oh, was somebody saying something? Oh, sorry. So yeah, we have a couple examples here of conflict trees where we have causes at the bottom, the core problem as the stem or the trunk of the tree, and then the effects at the top. So we look at Kenya, for example, a core problem that they have is, let's say, land alienation. And so the causes at the bottom or the roots of that tree will be, for example, corrupt political leaders, current constituencies, law, freedom and equity, unequal development, and colonial boundaries that were set in the past. And then as that contributes to the problem of alienation, we have a lot of bad effects that come from that. Things like raiding, fear, killing, looting, and unfair representation. Here's another more complex conflict tree between Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and members of the host community. And so if we look in the middle, if we look at the trunk of the tree, we can see the core problems being things like increases in food prices, falling wages in the low wage sector, the influence of international NGOs on the job market, etc. The causes for these things are at the bottom. So we have things like segregation, the lack of land or scarcity of land, poverty, unemployment, and the bad effects that come out of that are things like spread of fake news, bad security, members of the community being blackmailed, mistrust and fear, and more. Conflict trees can be a very good resource in terms of kind of writing down, contextualizing, and thinking about ways we can implement interventions or thinking about ways we can promote peace in particular situations. And so I think it would be good for us as a community or a global community to become familiar with the most serious issues of our time. So we have, you know, the most covered, I think, in the media right now is the war between Russia and Ukraine. There's also a lot of conflicts that I think aren't necessarily as popularized, but are just as important. When we look at places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Haiti, those all have peace-related issues going on in those particular countries. If we look according to the Council of Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, there's actually 27 ongoing conflicts in the world. The tracker categorizes conflict into 3 groups: worsening, unchanging, and improving. And right now, there's not a conflict described as improving. And relative to the past slide, even countries that can seem peaceful, for example, can have violence-related things happening or getting worse. I would even argue that if we look at, for example, the United States and China, that's happening. And I'll kind of explain the context of why I think that's happening in a couple of slides, because there's a unique approach from a former Nobel Prize winner that we will talk about in ways of promoting peace. So one thing I think that's important to understand when we think about peace is the idea of population. Population dynamics are changing across the globe. Right now, we have a lot of migration going. So there's a lot of people flowing from country to country, whether they're going there for holiday, whether they're going to live and work. And those things all bring peace and violence related things to them. For example, in the United States, there's a lot of people who migrate to come to the US to work. In a way, that can promote peace in the sense that it promotes trade between countries, which is what we'll talk about later on. But in some ways, it can promote violence and conflict because there can be people that don't like that, or people who think something bad of it, or people who want to harm people for some reason related to the migration. Aging populations is something that's super important to think about. If we look at countries in Europe, right now, their population is not sustainable and it's going down. So they have to think about techniques like migration in order to facilitate, more economic growth and more sustainable social services via tax money. And bringing that migration in can have impacts on peace, depending on how the general population views it or depending on how policy unfolds. There's also resource strain that will happen because populations are getting bigger and there's going to be more competition for resources. There's ethnic and racial conflict, which happens a lot and will probably happen even more as populations change, as borders become more malleable, or not malleable, but crossable and things like that. And then there's also religious conflict because right now in the world, there's trends like secularism, but then there's also trends where particular religions are growing faster than others, or people who are of different religions or different you could think of as like denominations between religions are coming into contact with each other more. So also politics and policies are super important really in the peacemaking process. They have huge impacts. And so we want to view it from the lens of kind of the levels of impact or that pyramid we had talked about before. There's the intergovernmental level with organizations like the United Nations or the World Bank or the International Criminal Court. There's continental, so how, for example, like the continent of Europe or how the continent of Asia and their internal politics would impact peace within that particular region. There's regional, so we could think about Western Europe versus Northern Europe, or we could think about Southeast Asia versus West Asia. We can think about things at the country level, and then we can think about things in relation to war, which spans across boundaries. And so this is the impact that policies and politics can have, or at least the way we can think about policies and politics can have on the peacemaking process. And so now we get to the exciting part of what are the most beneficial strategies of dealing with conflict and violence. So the first is getting rid of exclusion, sorry. So if we get rid of exclusion, that will deal with a lot of the problems. Many of the problems come from, if we think back to the previous slides, things like inequality, conflict between particular ethnic or religious or racial groups, etc. So if we don't exclude particular people or groups or populations who don't have as much money or financial resources, that will lessen the amount of conflict or violence they have between those people. Next is reduce gender-based inequality. So while we've made a lot of progress, especially in some parts of the world in terms of gender inequality, there's still a lot of issues. Those contribute a lot to violence and conflict. And so if we address that particular thing, which is one of our UN Sustainable Development Goals, that would make a big difference. Fight environmental degradation and climate change, which will bring about a lot of problems with violence and conflict because it will increase things like migration and situations that's not ideal, or will increase things like resource strain or, impacts on water sources and things like that. There was a typo here for some reason, and the slides on Canva didn't capture the previous changes, but I put distribute family wealth as one bullet point. Even within families, there can be some people who are fortunate and non-fortunate, and if people have stronger family units and promote more cohesion, then there won't be as much inequality, and we could reduce violence and conflict between things like that. We want to control arms sales and make sure that we're not giving conditions to incite more violence and conflict, especially from rogue groups or people who want to take action for some reason. We want to have less talk and more action. So actually implement policy change that's meaningful and not just meant to be kind of talking heads on TV. We want to promote democracy and the idea that everyone can contribute to the process of voting, creating policy. Everyone can contribute to the idea of shaping their country, their community to the way that they want, and that it's done on a majority basis and everyone has a voice and can contribute. We want to fix intergenerational relations, so relations between generations, build an integrated peace movement, and then we also want to look within. There's a particular strategy within the sub-Saharan African context that is very good. We have the idea of peace rallies. So in some countries like Cameroon, this is done by holding in one's hand the tree of peace and then walking through the streets and doing a rally, gathering a big crowd and having a large peace movement, which can have a very large impact. It can grab people from different communities together. It can bring news across the country. It can be covered by media and have a huge impact. This is something that happens in the African context that's really beneficial and could be a great strategy for anyone here that's living in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. There are some qualities that we need to have in the peacemaking process to make everything smooth. These are personal and relational qualities. I summarized them here. I'll read through them. So personally, we want to make sure that we're diplomatic and sensitive. So the idea that we actually want to work with other people and that we're sensitive and understanding to the things that other people are experiencing. That we're creative and we have practical problem-solving ability when it comes to particular violence and conflict issues, that we're flexible, adaptable, and we can self-assure ourselves that we are doing things in a positive manner. We're going about things positively and with the idea for collaboration and the idea that even if something is really bad, there's something really pressing going on, we can still keep our composure and do things in an evidence-based and rational manner. And then there's also relational things. So with violence and conflict, there's always going to be at least two parties. There's going to be multiple stakeholders who are being affected. So we want to make sure that between the relationships of those different stakeholders, we have empathy and humility. We have tranquility and resilience, mindfulness and hope, idealism and realism, honest and trustworthiness, and unattachment and a sense of humor. And so there's one person that I would like to mention, I think that has a large impact. His name is Frédéric Passy. He was awarded the first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901. He founded the first French Peace Society, which held a Congress in Paris during the 1878 World Exhibition. And he opposed France's colonial policy because it does not promote free trade. When it comes to free trade, that's probably one of the largest ways in which we can promote peace. And he says it here, one primary goal we should aim for is to accelerate implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement via capacity building, among other things. According to Frédéric Passy, the first Nobel Peace Prize laureate, free trade between independent nations promotes peace. If countries are working and collaborating with each other and they're making trade, then it doesn't make sense for them to be violent, for example. So if one country is good at making textiles and one country is good at agriculture and they're making trade between each other, they're dependent on each other, or at least relatively dependent on each other, that promotes peace between those countries, for example. And so when we see places like the EU who have a lot of trade and they have a lot of collaboration between each other, there tends to be a very strong amount of peace there relative to countries or regions that don't have a lot of trade with each other. And that's why I mentioned before, for example, that the US and China could be an example of a growing conflict issue, because there's more competition between those countries economically, and they each try to go across the world and make their own partnerships and their own impact, and they reduce the trade between themselves with things like restrictions on trade or taxes or whatever. That can be an erosion of peace because of the lack of trade or the diminishing amount of trade. And so thankfully, we're all here connected via Zoom across the entire world. We all have the ability to access media and see what things are going on. And so I think it's super important for us to call things out. I feel that here in the US is we're relatively in a privileged position here in the US. And I think it's super important, especially for young people in the US, that if we see there's a crisis going on in Yemen or in Syria or in Sudan, we should have the ability and we should have the desire to speak up and bring awareness to it, because our platform is relatively large across the world. And I think that everyone here can have a big difference by, calling things out, going on social media, making it known that we observe something going on that's bad and that needs to be resolved. And that can bring a lot of benefits, or that can bring a lot of action towards addressing problems for people that are experiencing something across the world, even if it has nothing to do with us and even if it doesn't impact us at all personally. I think we should think about how things will change moving forward. When we think about media and traditional media, right now it's not quite clear, at least here in the US, whether or not people view it as a pro or a con now, because they have a big competitor, which is social media, which is more of a grassroots type of media where individuals can post and go viral and have a huge impact. It creates a lot of connectivity across the world between people who are at the grassroots level, for example, instead of having people who are in the middle or the top of the pyramid who are kind of promoting a message. So we don't know how that will change things, but we should think about that moving forward and how we can adapt and strategize to have a better impact on peace. And then also there's globalization. So we're all relatively becoming more connected and dependent on each other, even if I think that some countries and regions have tried to reverse this trend. And so knowing that globalization on average is just growing over time, we should think about what impact or effect that this has on peace. One of the unique things, or one of the good things about this, is that, as we talked about on the last couple of slides, trade between countries or dependence between countries can promote peace, because you kind of need to have good relationships and you're both reliant on each other. And so hopefully that can be a good sign that peace will get better as we go on. And hopefully we get better at doing things like promoting gender equality as time goes on and more. And so before we head to the discussion phase of our presentation, I would just like to encourage everyone again to use PPIAI, Peace Movement, on social media. That way we can give everyone the ability to connect and engage after the session is over. We can see how you all are doing with your own grassroots conversation and movements as they come. Please tag us, the Public Policy in Africa Initiative, on LinkedIn and Twitter, and also our founder, Hugh, and myself. Please share your experience, the movements you would like to start, some of the things you recognize going on in the world, or whatever makes you comfortable. And so hopefully everyone learned a lot. We can have a conversation between everyone. We have multiple people from different countries and continents, so it would be nice to hear from everyone, whether people have particular questions or discussion topics they would like to talk about, or anything in the session they would like to ask questions about or provide more clarity about or discuss. So you can raise your hand, or you can comment in the chat, whichever one is most comfortable for you. And then I see one question: hi, are we going to have access to this recording? Yes, we will post the recording. We will post the recording on YouTube so everyone has access. And so we have a few people who have raised their hands. I think, is it Tendai who was first? You can just go ahead and, if you have your hand raised, you can just go ahead and unmute and begin.
All right. Good evening. Can you hear me?
Good evening. Yes, I can hear you.
All right, good evening once more. This is James speaking from Nigeria. Now, to start with, that was a very elaborate presentation. Very well done, Benjamin. Having said that, some of us are quite new in the field of peace advocacy. So there are a number of concepts used that are a bit strange to me in particular. And I'll appreciate if you can throw more light very quickly. One of those concepts is savior complex. What does it mean?
Sorry, you were a little scratchy, but the last thing you said which type of conflicts? What does it mean? What was the type of conflict you mentioned?
Okay, no, savior complex. Savior complex.
Okay, would you mind typing it in the chat?
Oh yeah, I let me do so very quickly.
Yes, sorry.
Hey, Ben, I'm sorry to chime in. I have a quick definition if that would be helpful.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Hey, everybody, my name's Tim. I had the privilege to work with Ben and an incredible team on this presentation. I'm also like a white man from a rich part of America. Savior complex is basically when privileged folks go into maybe conflict zones or places in which folks have been historically marginalized and believe that they have solutions to local people's problems is a savior complex. The fact that you come from a privileged background for those people sort of that to them is their credibility, that they have authority to speak on local issues and provide the quote unquote best solutions. It's a fallacy.
Yes, thank you for that, Tim. Yes, I think savior complex can be a big thing. It can be a big thing, for example, from the vantage point he just mentioned. Also, I can even see it relative to myself. For example, I was born here in the US. I didn't grow up like in a rich community or anything. I grew up, without that much money, but I got the privilege of going to a good school. And, when I went for 4 years, went to graduate school and came back home, I feel like my perspective is a bit different. The amount of opportunities I have is a bit different. And so I can view things from a relatively savior complex, if you could say that. Or, my dad is also from Cameroon. And so whenever I go back and visit, I can also have that same kind of impact or mentality. And so we should try to think about how we can diminish that things from the appropriate context or from the point of view of where we're at, so we don't, complicate things or make things worse with the savior complex.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for that.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Hello, colleagues. It's Tendai here from Zimbabwe. Sorry, my phone had frozen earlier, so I couldn't unmute. So now I managed to unmute. Thank you for the presentation. Very well done. I just have a question on the conflict tree. Maybe to simplify it a bit, do the branches represent anything? What do we put where? Those problems that you listed on right at the bottom, does it signify the latent conflict that we can't see? What's the significance? Where do we put what on the conflict tree? I believe it's an important tool to help us analyze the conflict and also design, like you mentioned, interventions that are appropriate and things like that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. Sorry. We have the causes at the bottom. The causes kind of represent the root of the tree. So the root of the tree is ultimately what's in the ground, pulling in all the nutrients, that it has the largest impact on whether or not the tree is alive or dead, for example. And it's underneath the ground where you can't quite necessarily see everything as easily, if that makes sense. So that's why we have the causes on the bottom. So the causes could be things like unequal development, for example. That may not be what is the most salient thing that we look at whenever we're understanding a conflict. We may not address the root causes at first. The things that are most visible, for example, is the top of the tree or the effects. So things like rating, hatred, suspicion, killing. It's very easy to want to try to treat the effects or try to treat the outcome of a particular problem, when in reality, we should try to be addressing what's underlying the entire thing or the root of the problem, which are the causes. And then we have the core problem. So the problem is connecting, for example, the causes and effects, which is why our problem is the tree trunk. So hopefully that helps.
Okay.
Thank you.
It
Okay.
does. It does. Sorry, you said the trunk connects the root causes. Sorry, can you come again on the trunk?
Yes, the trunk connects the causes and the effects. So you have these causes down here, you have these bad things that are happening, and it's going to contribute to a core problem, which then has these effects that happen. Hopefully that's a better way to put it.
Yep, sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for that wonderful presentation. It's quite a very detailed one. I'm Okpeyemi Adewale from Nigeria, and I'm happy to be part of this presentation. I am happy that you, during your presentation, you mentioned issue of inequality as one of the key things, and also the issue of education. You know, personally, I believe that with dispensation that we are in, the issue of peace and conflict will continue to arise. But is there a way that the issue of inequality, even among Africans, you know, that there is no, people do not see others are being superior to other people in the continent? Because if the inequality, I think, is one of the main issue in the African continent. And number two, the orientation. There should be a kind of kind of inclusion of reorientation in terms of our education. Our education tends to do acquisition of what do you call it? Acquisition of certificates to get a position or what all this. But I feel that for as part of conflict peace movement, the issue of education should be stressed. And inside that education, the greatness of Africans, the greatness within the African continent should be the things that, you know, we that should be promoted. I don't know if I think it's more or less a contribution, but I want you to elaborate on how do we go about this issue of inequality? An average African, maybe somebody from Cameroon now may feel that, okay, in a position of maybe there is a particular a forum, or, you know, instead of coming together to collaborate, home and people at home and diaspora, you know, that inequality is one of the major things. Somebody mentioned savior complex, where it can somehow be related to that. But I think it's, if you can just speak a little bit on that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So one thing to mention is that I didn't, like, when I was in school, I didn't study peace studies, so I can only give my perspective from that and just what I've learned. I think if we think about inequality in a balanced way, inequality doesn't necessarily have to be that the people at the top are purposefully kind of imposing bad conditions on the people at the bottom. I think we had, for example, mentioned before that we could have inequality, for example, that's intended and unintended. So I think we should first think about, okay, is the inequality that we're talking about, does it intendedly cause problems with violence and conflict, or is it happening through an unintended manner? I think that what happens when you have, for example, a group of people who have either too much power or too much money relative to the other people is that the people who have more tend to want to promote their interest, and those interests are competitive with the other people. It's not that they necessarily want to like bring harm, or they want to create violence or conflict or create a lack of resources or whatever it is for the people who they're competing their interest with. It's just a byproduct of what happens. And so we should approach it from that particular perspective, I think, within the African context. I didn't grow up in Cameroon. I've just visited Cameroon a few times. I think that many times also it's easy to say that people who are like in power, or people who have the most resources or money or whatever, tend to be like a certain way morally. But I think that any person, for example, who were to get rich, or any person who were to have power, would probably act very similar to the people who were in power in the first place. So approaching it from that point of view, I think can make a large difference in terms of approaching the peacemaking process and interacting, for example, with business owners or the government or whoever it is that is creating violence or harm in a particular situation. I think the best ways to reduce inequality is to promote more social services and to promote better conditions for a community. I think that depending on how we view different economic systems, let's just assume that we're approaching this from a capitalistic point of view. At some level, it's good to have the idea that, you know, you can work harder and make more money, but you do want to make sure there's controls, that things don't get out of control, or that people don't take advantage of the situation, or things advance to a level of crony capitalism or something like that. So it's very complicated when we think about inequality and how to fix it, because I don't even know if there's particularly a perfect system that has even been demonstrated that it could be fixed. We have places like the Scandinavian countries, I guess, that do a good job, but that includes like a lot of taxing, that includes, you know, promoting a lot of social services, making sure you have things like universal healthcare. So it's a really complicated thing to think about, reducing inequality in relation to peace studies. So that's the response I guess I could give. If anyone else here has a unique opinion, please feel free to share it, related to how you would take this idea of inequality and address it to promote peace.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mercy. Can I go on? I have a question.
Yes, thank you.
Right. So this was very insightful, by the way. I just wanted to ask that how do we go about as individuals? How do we become problem solvers? So you had mentioned during the presentation that some conflicts are unimproving and are worsening. How do we as individuals, especially when especially when we're dealing with root causes like corrupt leaders, how do we as individuals begin to solve these problems? Because usually I think it's easier to say that we can address certain issues from the grassroots, say from the grassroots, right? Like with NGOs and all of that. But how do we solve the problem when it's from the top, for example? And, you know, as individuals, I feel like it's a very tricky thing. You cannot just go up and start speaking about the government. You could put yourself in harm's way. So how do we as individuals begin to solve problems that are not just very easy? You know, we've had like very violent conflict, and these things have not just reason from the grassroots level. It's because people at the top have made decisions, and that's why these conflicts have persisted over time. So how do we as individuals begin to solve these problems? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a very complicated question to answer. I would say we should think about having a balanced view about the impact that government has and then the impact that a community has when it comes to violence. I think that no government itself wants to deal with violence or wants to deal with conflict. I think just as much as, for example, a normal person doesn't want to deal with their children fighting, it's a headache. You have to punish someone, you have to, go implement some kind of thing to change that or to help it. And then if you don't, then you'll have other parents who are coming and saying, oh, you're a bad parent. It's the same thing with the government. No government wants to have conflict and violence where, the international community is watching them, their own community is angry at them. They have to go implement the government or not the government, but the military, and they have to go to the media and things like that. So I don't think the governments particularly want these things to happen. I think there's a lot of conditions that can happen that can lead to a violence or conflict that government policy can, for example, impact. But I think we have to look at things like, okay, how long have the political leaders even been in power? Do they have the tools to fix what they want to fix? What's the impact of outside things that they don't have control over that can impact a particular violence or conflict? And then when we think about like the general population, like how does that change the way we go about interventions? So things like war and conflict or like terrorist groups, I don't know too much about, so I would be hesitant to give an opinion or an answer on. I would say things that I can think about, especially in the African context, that I would say I understand enough to comment on. Let's say, for example, something like trash collection. Burning trash in public is pretty bad for the environment. It leads to a lot of pollutants. It leads to a lot of problems. It can lead to things like wildfires, et cetera. I think the government does have a responsibility to implement a system of waste collection and then waste disposal. I know here in the US, we have like garbage trucks that kind of go around and then they have like a trash dump, they go dump everything. I do think, however, like the general population also has a part to play within that particular thing. Because also here in the US, like we have laws against littering, for example. So if the government puts in this intervention where they say, hey, we have garbage trucks that come pick up all the garbage, people have to say, okay, now we need to collect our garbage and put it in one centralized place per residence to make it easy for them. If they're still throwing garbage everywhere or they're just still doing things the way that was done before, that would de-incentivize the government, I think, to implement positive interventions. So I think in many ways, there's like a collaboration between the government or people at the top and then the normal communities. And I think a lot of times there's a lot of conditions we don't see or causes we don't see for why problems don't get fixed when it comes to governments. I do definitely think that, there can be corruption or there can be problems that happen. But I think we should try to have discernment and understanding like, okay, this is a problem that has to do with corruption only. And this is a problem that has to do with corruption, yes, or a lack of action, yes, but what part does everybody have to play in this particular intervention? Because I don't think that any government ever wants to deal with problems that have to do with peace and conflict. So that I think would be my answer. If anyone else wants to chime in with an opinion or a similar or different opinion, that would be really good too. There is one question I saw before really quick that I do want to address that came up about 10 minutes ago. How trade contributes to peace. So trade contributes to peace because when you look at the way a country operates, we talked about, for example, how inequality is a big issue. Countries have to produce a lot in order to take care of the population. You have to have clothes, you have to have housing, you have to have food, you have to have water. And all those things are very resource intensive, and it'd be very hard for a country to get these things on their own. And even if you could get these things on your own, you're competing with other people. We have a lot of rivers, lakes, seas that people use that multiple different people use or multiple different countries use at the same time. So the more that those countries collaborate with each other, whether it's through trade or something similar, the more likely they are not to have issues with each other, because at some level, their well-being and their prosperity is dependent on another party or another country doing their part. So I think that's probably the easiest way I could describe why trade benefits two parties, because they're kind of dependent on each other, or at least they benefit each other from specializing in different things. And the more that you benefit from each other, or the more that you have a mutual relationship, the less likely you are to fight with them. So you're more likely to fight with someone random on the street for bumping into you than you would be fighting your own brother or sister for bumping into you. So hopefully that answers that
Ben?
question. And another, yes?
Ben, can I also just add on how trade can benefit the peace process?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So I'm thinking of a situation where trade increases visibility. So whatever it is you're doing as a country, because you're in these various trade platforms, you are quite visible, you are watched. I think it increases accountability and visibility. So you're more likely to act in a peaceful manner because you are sort of like being watched, you're on the spotlight because of all these collaborations that you've made, and all eyes are on you on how you're operating. So you're sort of like obliged to maintain peace. And like Ben rightfully said, I will need one thing from the next country, so I need to maintain good relations with them. Thank you.
Hello, Ben. Can I add some things?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lucky Chima. I'm also a student of conflict resolution and coexistence here in America. And thank you very much, Ben, for this session. It's really very enlightening. I actually wanted to contribute to the trade conversation, but I think everything has been talked about. But going back to the question, you said if somebody has something to talk about, how policy contributes. I think in my experience and maybe like the little time that I've spent trying to learn about conflict resolution, I think one of the biggest things that can have an impact with regards to the topic of peace is implementation of policies, actually. I think in Africa, one of the biggest problems we have is implementation of laws. For somebody like me who has like a background, in law, and I pretty much saw a lot of laws in Nigeria that, these laws are there, but a lot of them are not implemented. And it goes back to how the executive deals with laws, the legislature actually implements laws when it is that those laws are enacted. So look at some other countries, for instance, where it is that they try to keep things intact. It is simply because they implement policies. I think Ben mentioned about how there are laws regarding littering in America. There are laws regarding, street parking. Little laws like that are implemented. If these things are started from the grassroots, it goes a long way to contribute to how the general community actually is impacted, for instance. So the policy, for instance, that I'm talking about is how peace building can be taught at the grassroots, like primary or secondary schools. What I recall when I was actually a kid is that, Nigerian history really wasn't even taught so much in the classes then when we were in school. And, a lot of us grew up with the stories that were told by our parents about how this tribe is this, that tribe is that. And, we didn't really learn about the history of those persons, the reason why it is that we are together as one people. And those things that we did not learn, today we learn them from. In fact, I've learned a lot of Nigerian history from outside Nigeria than I learned when I was back home in Nigeria. So I think small policies like that, like teaching children in secondary schools about SDGs, sustainable development, how it is that they can contribute to the general community, African community in this context, goes a long way. Talking to them about how peace too can, impact on the African environment also goes a long way. Somebody talked about how it says that, Africans, we should see ourselves as one and all that. This is where the trade policies actually come in. If you check, for instance, there are countries of the world today who are quote unquote superpowers, but then can never fight against each other. I'll give an example, Russia and China, just because they have almost the same ideologies. And because of that, trading between them is quite easy. So you would hardly find these two countries going into war, going into conflict with each other. Things like this can also help. And these are from the grassroots. When little policies are placed, the people who from the grassroots know about these policies and how they are implemented, they go a long way to create like a system where peace flows. Also look at like some of the Nordic countries. Policies work. The smallest of policies work. You really can't see small communities having problems with each other because they know their history. They know what it is that this other community contributes to them, and they know how to maintain that peace with each other from small little policies. So I think if we try in Africa to, make policies work, those policies that we have, if we make them work, it will go a long way in contributing to peace generally in Africa. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lucky. Can I say something concerning Mercy's question in particular? Can I go on?
Yes.
Okay, meanwhile, thank you, Benjamin, for that presentation. It was really detailed and very apt. I'm Ruth Sorinadi from Nigeria. I want to talk about Mercy's question. She talked about how do we go about conflict resolution. That's the best possible way, especially with government and all that. I'm just doing a summary. Yeah, I know Benjamin talked about what you said. It's important. I just also want to add to what you said. Of course, that's having in mind that no government wants conflicts. That's very key. And then Lucky has talked about that's teaching peace at the grassroots. But I also want to add, also liaising with thought leaders. When you were making your presentation, Benjamin, you talked about you showed the 3 tiers of that's influencers. I'll use that word, respect to conflict resolution. And the first one you talked about were the governments, the leaders, political leaders, military, and all that. The thing is, some of us have access to these persons. That liaison, knowing that conflict resolution is not something that you do on your own. You actually need a whole level of collaboration and very strategic collaboration. For example, in a community where there is conflict, because in conflict resolution, you have to have a target. You cannot resolve the whole conflicts in the whole world, or maybe in the nation, or whatever. That have a target. Like there is a situation here, but this is how I want to bring solution. Make it specific. That's what exactly. There are so many issues that are subject matter of conflicts, but you could choose to pick one at a time. Then there is usually a thought leader in that particular sphere that you could liaise with, you could engage with, you could share your ideas about how this should be solved. The thing is, we are very used to pointing out problems. Yes, but if we can break down the solution, make it as simple as possible. It could be difficult, yes, but just be specific and then choose one problem per time to address. Just like Chima was saying, I am a lawyer. I have a background. I am a lawyer, and we know that our problem in Nigeria, that's my country, it's more, and in Africa generally, it's more with implementation. So we already know the problem. Okay, so in addition to what he said, that's reaching out to this, that's the younger generation, let's also reach out to thought leaders in any sphere that we want to see a solution to. And then another thing that's conversations. Now we are in the 21st century, using media, in as much as this is something that has been, it's very good, but when it's not used well, it could backfire. A lot of people come out on social media and just call out leaders, and oh yeah, it's good sometimes bring about solution, but there is something about manner of approach. There is a way to go about it that instead of bringing solution, the person becomes defensive about that issue. So I think that in using social media, which is a very vital tool, let's also learn how to communicate, and communicate in a very civil manner. Let the focus be on the problem and not on the person. Because let's say if it's a situation of climate change, and maybe there is someone in charge of that parastatals, yes, you could, but if we can channel the solution we are proposing to a specific issue on the issue and not on the person, except in of course, there are situations where you would need to maybe call out the person and all. But if we can channel it on the solution, not just calling out the problem, that channel it on the solution, highlight that thing, and then you could do it personally. If you have an email of the organization or something, you could first try. There is something in law with respect to maybe addressing governments. There is something about before you most times with governmental institutions, before you go all out for a full-blown litigation, they usually ask, there's usually a room for mediation, that after all other private channels have been explored to sort the problem and it did not work, before you now go all out. But most times we just go all out first. But let's explore reaching out to that person personally. Let's explore that, and not just with the problem, with a solution to it. And let's be specific. I think this would help, one at a time. I believe this would help in resolving some conflicts in our communities. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for that. I think a couple of things I'll mention, yes, in response is I think that, as you said, like at the grassroots level, this is related to what Lucky said, but at the grassroots level, we should try to think about how we can help self-promote laws that are positive. And then we also, when we engage with politicians, we need to make sure that we're coming forth with solutions. I think Mercy had started off the question, and she had said in the chat that there's like people who are calling the shots, and there are people who are causing harm and people who are profiting from that. I think that definitely is true, but the question is, who are those people, and are they actually the government? I think I don't know too much about the African context within that regard, so I wouldn't comment, but I would say, for example, here in the US, I think that the shadow people are probably more corporations than there are politicians. So there are corporations that will do things to make money and they will try to impact things. But I think that if people at the grassroots level try to self-promote laws that work, I think that can have a huge impact. So when thinking about peace, like peace ultimately is just like institutions that are put in place that kind of impact violence and conflict. So if we think about things like what can we self-do within our communities to address these problems? So if we see, for example, that a particular group of people is being harmed by their environment, being destroyed by like waste from a particular company, we all should speak up and say, hey, we need some environmental protection from that. Let's go to our leaders and liaise with them and work with them to get that done. So I think that is a good way to try to go about doing the laws, like in reference to all the responses we just got.
Hello, can I go now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Benjamin. It was a nice presentation and I really liked it and I grasped a lot from the presentation. My name is Macbeth. I'm from Ethiopia and I have a quick question. I just wanted to know what will be the role of youth in post-conflict reconstruction? And not only the role, but how youth can be, youth like me can meaningfully participate in post-conflict construction.
Can you repeat that again? Sorry, I didn't hear. You said, how can you participate in like the construction of peace? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, yes, thank you. So I think there's multiple different ways that we all can contribute individually. So I had mentioned, for example, some personal and relational qualities. We do ultimately, like, especially down here at the grassroots level, we want to try to connect people in the community and encourage collaboration between people in the community. So if you have a strong mass of people who want to promote peace or end a particular problem that's existing within the community, if you gather everyone on your side, that will make it much easier to address that problem. And then also you can, for example, liaise with people who are in power to try to get something done. So we had talked about this pyramid. People down here at the grassroots level, we can interact, for example, with people in the middle level. So we can reach out to people who are NGO leaders in our community or professionals, people who are journalists, people who are ethnic and religious leaders, and we can see and work with them and see, okay, how can we address this particular problem? Is it better for us to work together as a small community or a medium-sized community to either self-implement a law, or for us to go and build something physically, or for us to start a new initiative on social media that brings awareness? Or should we, for example, contact the government and try to lobby them or try to convince them to implement something from the top down? I think there's a wide different array of strategies that you could use, but I think at the grassroots level, you have a lot of power that's not realized, especially if you gather more people in the community and bring people to your cause, and then you try to liaise your way up the pyramid, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Benjamin. My name is Lebohang Kobola from South Africa. My question relates more to humanitarian aid agencies and how they go about peace advocacy in politically unstable contexts. I mean, sometimes they find themselves in very difficult positions where I think, as you said, they have to call things out, but at the same time, how do they do this without falling out with the government? Because they are sometimes at a risk when they do this, that they'll be kicked out from countries in which they are providing this assistance, which will obviously impact people at the grassroots level. So how would they sort of tread carefully as they call out these causes of conflict to try and influence changes?
I think that's a very complicated question that I don't know how comfortable I would feel answering. I think that I have multiple opinions on it. I think I think one, like, let's say, for example, in the sub-Saharan African context, I think one, we should try to be independent when we deal with issues that are related to peace and conflict. So I think those organizations are very good, but I think we shouldn't try to rely on them too much. I think those organizations definitely serve a purpose and bring a lot of resources to the community and a lot of impact, but not all the time do they have strictly just our peace initiative like in mind. And I think the same problem that those organizations could face in terms of like being kicked out could be faced by the general population. I think it's just a super tricky question. I don't know if I would be able to give a good answer or feel comfortable giving a good answer. I would just say we don't want to try to rely on them too much. And I think that they should try to implement strategies as well, like that we see here in this presentation, to interact with government. I don't know if I have any answer beyond that that would be a good one.
Okay,
My
thanks.
apologies. Yeah.
I don't know, Ben, can I add something, if you don't mind?
Yes.
I don't know. So just a little bit to the question. I mean, just giving instances like in some parts of Nigeria where it is that, you know, humanitarian organizations come in and they try to do their work, and especially in the northeast of Nigeria, and, you know, they're accused by the government of sponsoring, you know, terrorist groups. I think the first thing humanitarian organizations should understand is, I mean, the government is the government of the place. Whichever territory you're working, you should work in accordance with the laws that are obtained in those places. So while it is that all the principles of humanitarian action or humanitarian aid should apply, you trying to be non-partial, you trying to help people make sure that lives are saved, the government sets the laws, and whatever the case may be, you have to liaise with the government. I think that's where humanitarian negotiation comes in. Just the humanitarian organizations just have to find a way to negotiate with the government, having to help them see the need or the importance for their work. I think one of the turning points for humanitarian activities all over the world today was when the civil war was fought in Nigeria in 1967, where the Doctors Without Borders came as a result of the ICRC not being able to call out some of the issues that were happening as far as, you know, people suffering. So there is also the part that humanitarian organization can play by calling out some of the things happening in a conflict terrain, without having to endanger the lives of the people who are there. And I think in the trainings of a lot of humanitarian organizations, there are these trainings that the staff or the persons who are going to work in those communities, or who even understand the context, are going to go through. But just to point out the most important thing, humanitarian aid development work should always be from top down. Sorry, should always be from down top. If it comes from the top-down approach, almost always it never works, because it's always the humanitarian organization or the development organization coming to impose whatever they feel like is the solution to the problem on the people. Well, you know, you have to deal with the government, you have to deal with the local communities, you have to understand what will be safe for those people to do in that point or at that point in time, what will be okay for them to do, what will not endanger their lives, irrespective of the fact that you're trying to, you know, solve their problems. So the government is important, the people are important, the safety of the people are also important. These are some of the things that humanitarian organizations will look into. And do not be surprised that in some cases, even the worst of conflicts, some humanitarian organizations might not be able to do anything at all, just because they consider the general safety of the people, and also they consider what obtains government-wise in the places where it is that they want to carry out their activities.
Yes, thank you. I definitely think that's a good point. And these organizations have to interact with everybody who's a stakeholder, instead of picking a stakeholder and then imposing what they think is correct, because that, I think, is probably where a lot of problems come that they have within a particular context. And then also, I think that they shouldn't probably go as hard with value judgments against particular people as well, because whenever there's conflict, people don't necessarily want to be in conflict, but it arises because of conditions or things that happen. And I think value judgments and then also not interacting with everyone who's a stakeholder is a big problem. There are quite a bit of questions that are in chat that I do want to answer real quick, so we don't kind of leave those people out. So There's one question in the Q&A section that says, how do we go about this peace building process in societies where it is difficult to get your voice heard, more of exclusion than inclusion? So I think a couple of strategies you could use, for example, is to recruit more people, to increase your voice. So if it's one person who's crying out about a problem or 10 people, it may not be as visible. But if you have, for example, 1,000 or 2,000 people crying out about a problem, and these people are putting up signs or billboards or pickets or they're going to political buildings or they're going to places and making up a lot of noise, I think that can be a good strategy. Also, the power of social media. So if you work with people across social media who bring awareness to something, or you talk to a journalist who can bring awareness to something, that can be a way to amplify your voice or amplify awareness around a particular issue. So hopefully that answers that question. And then there's a few in the chat. There was one that was posted a while ago, about 20 minutes ago. The question is, in South Africa, we have a serious case of violence inherited from our unresolved history of colonialism and apartheid issues. So when citizens are frustrated by lack of service delivery, weak border control / migration governance, etc., they often resort to violence as a tool of conflict resolution. This worries me the most in relation to immigration issues because South Africa is known as the xenophobia capital of the continent. I believe this will affect the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Any suggestions about how to address this issue? I think when it comes to issues, I guess, about division amongst Africans or division amongst ethnic groups, I think the best thing to do is try to remove the distinctions as much as possible. So it's good to hold on, for example, the fact that, you know, I'm a Bamileke tribe member or I'm X tribe, but I think we should have like a united ideal that we're going for, and then try to think about that. I think that if you were to look at in the US, for example, you can have multiple different diaspora members, for example, who care a lot about Africa, who want to go back, who engage with each other, and there's no discussion even of any kind of anti-tribal or anti-ethnic conflict. For example, you know, I'm Cameroonian, I can have 10 Nigerian friends and 2 Somalian friends and 3 South African friends here in the US, and never will we ever talk about what's between X person's tribe and my tribe or something like that, mainly because we all care about just improving Africa as a whole. There's not kind of any underlying where I'm trying to improve Africa as a whole, but I want to make sure the Bamileke do better than everyone else or whatever it may be. So I think uniting under a goal and seeing everybody as one is the best way to promote and get out of these like xenophobic ideas. And the whole idea of the African Free Trade Agreement is that, yeah, we can go and do business in other countries. We can trade with other countries. We can live in other countries. We can marry within other countries. We can all, you know, move about each other freely and do what we want. And a lot of people have the fear that, okay, everyone's going to flood one country and only stay in one country and never leave. And then I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think a lot of people have a big attachment to where they're born. So yes, they may temporarily move somewhere and make their money or do their business, but a lot of people have strong ties to where they're from and move back. So I think a lot of fears that people have or ideas they have about what will happen is just not as true as it appears in their head. If you look at the EU, for example, they have free ease of movement across the region, but I don't think you see like a mass migration of like people from one place to another to the extent that it causes the problems that people think would happen under an open border situation. So I think that's what my response would be for that particular question. And there's a lot of other questions that are really hard to keep up with in the chat. So if people don't mind like responding or engaging with people in the chat, just like we are in voice, I think that would be good. So does anyone have, there's another question for the Q&A. How can we resolve issues to do with mob justice, more especially the ones being caused by injustices and witchcraft, which is very common in African countries? That's That's a very complicated question, and I don't think I know if I could give a good answer to that question. I only know a little bit about it, and I've only experienced a little bit of it because I've been to Cameroon and spent a lot of time there, but not enough to be able to comment on something like as complicated or contentious as that. Does anybody have a response they would like to give for that particular question?
Please, what's the question?
Oh, I don't know if everyone can see these, but it says, how can we solve issues to do with mob justice, more especially the ones being caused by injustices and witchcraft, which is very common in African countries?
Okay. Good day, everyone. My name is Florence, and I'm calling in from Nigeria. I'm actually a peace researcher at the University of Calabar here in Nigeria. First, I want to thank you, Benjamin, for that eye-opening introduction and the presentation as a whole. Thank you for bringing up this issue of, in your presentation, the one that interests me the most was that of personal and relational qualities needed. And in answering that very question of injustice and witchcraft, I think witchcraft has to do with the traditional setting. And in peace and conflict studies, there's an emerging thematic area which seems to have been relegated to the background, but is really critical in the construction of peace and the entire peacemaking process, and that is culture. The issue of culture has not received enough attention in peace and conflict discourse. And culture as a powerful force bridges across differences. Culture brings people together and thus underpins social cohesion and peace. And if we are to make progress in terms of conflict prevention and peace, we must find a way to relate the issues touching on culture. Culture has various facets that comes along with it. We have the one of language, and talking about this issue of injustice. Injustice stems from the fact that, superiority, inequality, you're seeing that person like you're an inferior person. And that is where this issue of personal and relational qualities comes in handy. If we exercise empathy, if we exercise humility, and even try to understand the fact that everybody is equal, identify someone first as a human being before we try to bring in tribal, cultural, language, and every other thing. Sometimes we even look at the person from the gender perspective, and we also tend to check if the person, okay, is this person from my denomination? Of course, we down here in Nigeria can relate better. When a crime is committed, most people neglect the fact that we are talking about a crime here. They will neglect that fact and try to focus more on the personality of the person who has committed that crime, in terms of where the person is coming from, what language does he or she speak, which denomination, religion, and even inside the religion, for Christians, they try to also decimate it down to the denomination proper. Is this person a Catholic? Okay, he or she is my brother in Christ. So to hell with whatever crime that he has committed. That is where injustice creeps in. And until we try to deal with the issue of inequality and exclusion, we cannot truly have a peaceful society. And I would also want to stress the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who said that without inclusion and equality, peacemaking will not be a dream come alive. It will be a difficult process for us, because the fact remains that, the truth is that we cannot terminate conflicts. As far as there is human interactions with insatiable ones in man, there must be a point where we disagree. But is for us not to allow it to escalate to the point of violence. That is where we are coming from. And then in conclusion, I would say that based on the earlier given proposal for peace education to be taught at the grassroots, also to secondary and primary school students, there should be a greater element of these personal and relational qualities embedded in the peace curriculum, because all that we've been saying, economic, policy, and the rest of that, all the people that are at the helm of affairs, our political leaders, the economic leaders, they are first human beings. And if they can imbibe the principles of equality, the principles of empathy, humanity, of course, I think that whatever policies that they are making, it should be guided by that principle. Take, for instance, during the Nigerian Civil War, there was an organization that was formed solely to intervene in the hunger crisis that was ravaging the Biafran land. And these people, they came together to form this organization and called it American Jewish Emergency Efforts for Biafran Relief. This organization was in the United States. It was made up of 21 national Jewish organizations, and they came together and said, we cannot watch by and see a human being suffer and die. That is their principle. That was their guiding principle before they went on that venture to come together and form one indivisible organization just to help Biafra, because they saw in that war a genocide. That was what they said. From the Joint Church Archives that was published 3 years ago, you will see the account, you will see the meetings, the minutes of the meetings they had way back in 1967 that caused them to intervene in that humanitarian crisis. And for me, I feel and I think, realistically taking everything into account, that these personal and relational qualities matters the most, and they can help us to reconstruct these conflicts and as well promote global peace and security. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's a very good intervention. Thank you. That's a very good intervention, and I think that definitely answers the question and would help us a lot. It's 11:47 now, or it's 11:47 a.m. in the time I am in the US, or 5:47 in Douala time. I actually have to step off now, so I'll go ahead and end the presentation, but I would like to thank everyone for joining the presentation and contributing to the discussion. I feel like it was great. We had a large impact, and we're promoting peace, which is a very good thing. And we're going to have a large impact here as a small community within our group, and then also within our own communities. And so I would encourage everybody again to share on LinkedIn their experience, what they learned, things they noticed that's going on, what particular interventions they want to start. Please use our hashtag PPIAI peace movement. That way we can stay engaged, communicate with each other. We can talk to each other, follow each other's progress and their particular grassroots movements and other things. And yeah, I think it was a very great presentation. Again, I thank everybody for joining. I have to step off now, so I'll go ahead and end the presentation, but I will definitely be responding to everybody. Please follow us on LinkedIn, the PPIAI, myself, and also our founder. And we'll definitely stay engaged with everyone and respond to everyone's ongoing comments and questions. So thank you everybody for joining.